different, but it did. So again, it confirmed what we already knew. And so again, what you'll hear all cough, sneezes, I mean, it's the nasty stuff you don't want to be around when somebody coughs, right? The reality is, yeah, I mean, if my kid coughs in my face, I'm going to get it. But the argument's being made that, you know, somebody who's not infectious, isn't coughing, needs to wear a mask. And that argument isn't a very good argument unless, you know, there's really good evidence that it actually stops the transmission. Now, we did have a recent study, I don't have it here, but the amount of SARS-CoV-2, and this was in a laboratory study, that is aerosolized is almost 85%. Okay, so some of it is respiratory, but a lot of it's aerosolized. If it's aerosolized, masks don't even matter. Okay, because again, aerosolized is it's in here, out here. It doesn't matter what your distance is. So the concept of a mask depends on it being in droplets only, and that distance would matter because droplets get pulled to the ground by gravity. And so again, you know, sometimes we make a lot of intuitive kind of say, well, this will work because, but the reality of science is a lot of times when we test it, I'd say half the time we're wrong, half the time we're right. We just don't know which half. But in all honesty, that's what scientific, you know, really scientific inquiry, scientific theory is all about. I will say, interestingly enough, when we talk about the last pandemic, one of the fathers of medicine, Osler, probably started Johns Hopkins and was one of the first guys to start thinking about cell or disease theory. He didn't believe in viruses, and so he actually died not believing in viruses because they weren't visible. And actually, all during 1918, 1920, actually, no one actually knew what viruses were. They did believe one guy, who was actually kicked out of Johns Hopkins, he ended up discovering RNA, and his last name was Perry, but he said, no. Spanish influenza is caused by something else, because at the time, Osler thought it was caused by something called influenza bacillus. Influenza bacillus, we now have a name for it, it's called Haemophilus influenza. It's a bacteria that's causing an atypical infection. And in all honesty, Perry came along and said, well, it's not in every person that we do an autopsy on. When we, again, get their respiratory secretions and then filter them through our ceramic filter, we don't always see influenza bacillus, so it can't be only cause. There has to be something going through this filter. It's called a filterable pathogen, okay? And guess what? Guess what filterable pathogens are called? Viruses. You know, we didn't have the technology to be able to see them at the time. So, interestingly enough, Osler, about a year and a half later, was in Oxford giving a speech, ended up getting the Spanish influenza, and actually died. So he died, smartest doctor in the whole world, died of something that he didn't believe in, which I think is kind of ironic, but regardless. So, again, this just goes back to that whole, you know, SARS-CoV-2 infected host versus droplets being a significant thing. If it's aerosolized, you know, what is the point? And again, I'd say if it's aerosolized, you know, it's probably, you know, at minimum not helping. So, and again, we're talking about children, and so the other thing about that is, I mean, my 5-year-old is gross to begin with. Okay? Much less, he can't wear a mask, much less wipe himself. Okay, so, and in all honesty, that to me is the biggest thing. Is we're asking kids. Earlier, you saw that even healthcare workers couldn't make a difference by wearing N95 respirators and influenza infections in a hospital. And you're going to say in an elementary school that a kid who can barely wipe himself needs to wear a mask to prevent another viral infection? That's just, I mean, it doesn't pass the smell test. Well, So the other thing is just looking at the virus itself. I'm talking, this is actually the spike protein, and probably, I don't know if you've been vaccinated, but if you've been vaccinated, this subunit is what you're actually being made to actually make proteins to. Interestingly enough, the receptor binding domain, I mean, there's so many different proteins, and actually an Emory paper recently showed that the protein on the surface, that's the nucleoprotein, is what actually confers long-term CD8 T-cell immunity. That's really nerdy. But the end of the paper said we ought to update the vaccine to include the nucleoprotein because the spike protein doesn't confer long-term immunity. So, and then again, what I'd say is the life cycle of the virus, again, is getting in there. We're kind of moving past the mask issue. All I wanted to do is present the mask data. So, entry of the virus in there, again, there's a lot more than just the spike protein. The spike protein is really what you're being vaccinated against when you get vaccinated. The nucleoprotein, the nucleocapsid, the receptor binding domain, all of those other proteins that somebody who's had a prior infection also has antibodies to. So sometimes with this vaccine, it's a narrow approach. It's not necessarily a wrong approach, it's just we've never really done something that narrow. And it's fine, but it's going to be easily bypassed, and maybe you've seen that recently. So, and anyway, this is actually the binding of the cell, which I think is pretty cool. But you can see all these proteins on it are not just, obviously those are the spike proteins attaching, but these would be the other proteins on the surface. And when you have the infection, you're going to have antibodies to all of those. Receptor binding domain, you're going to have it to the nucleocapsid, you're going to have all this. So, this, we can actually thank Peter McCullough for it, because actually I emailed him yesterday and I was like, I don't have time to get my slide deck together. So I was like, Peter, can I have your slide deck? And he was like, yeah, sure. Within 10 minutes, I was like, that's pretty cool. So this is really going to start about early ambulatory treatment of COVID-19. And I think the biggest thing that we've learned so far is there's a ton of data out there. I mean, literally, I spend probably 4 hours every morning reading the literature that comes across the press, okay? It is enormous. I mean, Jace can probably show you my files of things. I've kind of divided them into every different thing that I can think of because I know that I need to go back to it.